My name is Megan Calloway. I am 31 years old. And the laugh was not the cruel kind. That is the part one have thought about most in the years since. It was not a laugh designed to wound. It was the laugh of a man who found something genuinely amusing in the way that adults find children's drawings amusing. Not dismissive exactly, not intending harm, but operating from such a complete certainty that the thing in front of him was not serious that he did not even bother to construct a polite response. He just laughed, picked up his beer, changed the subject. I was 27. I had been running my consulting firm for 14 months. We had 6 clients. We had just closed a contract with a regional healthcare network that was the largest single engagement we had taken on and which I had spent 11 weeks negotiating and which would generate $480,000 in revenue over the following 18 months. I had 4 employees, 2 of them full-time, and I had moved out of my spare bedroom and into an actual office 3 months earlier. A small suite on the 4th floor of a building downtown with my name on the frosted glass door. I told my father about the healthcare contract at Sunday dinner. Not everything, not the number, not the negotiations, not the detail. Just that we had signed a significant new client and that things were going well. He nodded in the way he nodded when he was not fully listening, and then he asked if I had thought about getting a real job yet, and when I said this was a real job, he laughed. Just laughed. 3 weeks later his phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was David Hartwell, the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Health Systems, which was a regional healthcare network that employed my father's engineering consulting firm as a facilities contractor and had done so for 11 years. David Hartwell had a question about the operational efficiency assessment his organization had just commissioned from a firm called Callaway Strategic Partners and whether my father happened to know anything about it. My father did not know anything about it. My father did not know that Callaway Strategic Partners was my company. He did not know that the significant new client I had mentioned at Sunday dinner was the same organization that paid his firm's invoices every quarter. He did not know any of this because I had not told him, and he had not asked because he had laughed and changed the subject, and I had decided, in that specific moment, to let things develop at their natural pace. The pace turned out to be 3 weeks. Before I tell you what David Hartwell said to my father on that phone call and what my father said to me the following Sunday when he finally arrived at the conversation he should have had 3 weeks earlier, tell me where you are right now. What city, what time, what part of the world are you watching from? I want to know how far this travels before you decide whether what happened was coincidence or consequence. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house that ran on the specific logic of a man who had spent 30 years being right about things and had developed from that experience an absolute confidence in his own assessments that was occasionally accurate and occasionally the most expensive thing about him. My father, Robert Calloway, was a mechanical engineer who had built a small but legitimate engineering consulting practice over the course of his career and who had, in the process, developed a theory of professional success that was so specific to his own experience that it functioned less like wisdom and more like a map drawn for one particular journey and applied to all journeys regardless of terrain. The map said you get a technical degree, you work for someone else until you understand the field, you build relationships, you develop expertise, and eventually, if you are disciplined and patient, you build something of your own. That was the map. It had worked for him. He had applied it to everything. My mother, Carol, was a nurse practitioner who had the specific quality of a person who is very good at her work and very tired of talking about it at home, and who had developed over 25 years of marriage the diplomatic skill of redirecting conversations that were about to become arguments into conversations that were about something else entirely. He was not passive. She was strategic in the way that people who live with certain kinds of certainty become strategic. She had learned to route around obstruction rather than through it, and she applied this skill to me as well as to my father, which meant I had grown up with one parent who told me directly what he thought and one parent who suggested indirectly what she felt, and had navigated between them by learning to read what was true rather than what was said. My brother Kevin was 4 years older than me and had followed my father's map with a fidelity that made my father proud and that Kevin seemed genuinely content with, which I had no objection to because Kevin was a person who knew what he wanted and had gotten it, and that was a real thing regardless of whether the path was conventional. He had an electrical engineering degree, a position at a manufacturing firm in Cincinnati, a wife, a mortgage, a clear sense of what his weeks would look like for the foreseeable future. He was not unhappy. He was simply different from me in the specific way that people who want clear paths are different from people who want to make them. I was the one who did not fit the map. Not because I was disorganized or impractical. I was, if anything, more organized and more practical than anyone else in my family, which I had demonstrated in various ways since I was old enough to be trusted with responsibility. I was the one who had run the student government budget in high school, who had managed the finances for 3 campus organizations in college, who had identified at 22 that the thing I was best at and most interested in was helping organizations understand the gap between how they thought they were operating and how they were actually operating, and that this gap, which existed in almost every organization of any size, was something I could close for them in exchange for money. I had studied business and organizational psychology at Ohio State, which my father had approved of in the way he approved of things he could not argue against but did not fully endorse. The degree was real, the university was legitimate, he had no specific objection, he simply did not understand why I had not chosen something more technical. I told him I found people more interesting than machines. He said that was a fine thing to believe when you were 20 and would probably change. It did not change. After graduation, I spent 3 years at a management consulting firm in Columbus where I was good at the work and frustrated by the pace and by the specific dynamic of large firms where the relationship between the quality of your work and the trajectory of your career was mediated by so many layers of politics and hierarchy that the connection became impossible to trace. I left at 26 with a list of clients I had worked with, a clear sense of what I could offer them independently, and enough savings to give myself 18 months of runway. My father's response to my resignation was measured. He did not shout. He asked questions in the tone of a man who is trying to be fair while being fairly certain the answer will confirm what he already thinks. He asked about revenue projections. I showed him the spreadsheet. He studied it the way men study spreadsheets when they are looking for something to challenge and cannot immediately find it. He said the projections seemed optimistic. I said they were based on the conversations I had already had with potential clients. He said conversations were not contracts. I said I was aware of that. I did not tell him about the 2 clients I had already signed before I resigned. Not because I was hiding them. Because I had learned by 26 that telling my father things before I could show him results was simply adding unnecessary steps to a process that would arrive at the same place regardless. He would question the projections. I would show him the actuals. The actuals would speak more clearly than any projection. I just needed time for the actuals to develop. The 14 months between founding Callaway Strategic Partners and the Sunday dinner laugh were the most clarifying of my life and the most exhausting and the most certain I had ever felt that I was exactly where I was supposed to be doing exactly the thing I was supposed to be doing. My first two clients were a regional credit union and a mid-sized logistics company, both of whom I had worked with at my previous firm and both of whom, when I told them I was going independent, asked without much pause whether they could work with me directly. Those two engagements generated enough revenue to cover my first 6 months of operating costs and give me the confidence to pursue larger opportunities without the panic of a dwindling runway. The work itself was the same work I had been doing at the firm, stripped of everything except the actual substance. I came into organizations and I looked at the gap between intention and execution, the places where they thought they were doing one thing and were actually doing another, the processes that had made sense at one stage and were now producing friction, the communication failures that were generating costs that nobody had traced back to their source. I was specific, I was fast, and I did not soften my findings in the way that larger firms sometimes soften findings to protect long-term client relationships. I told organizations what I found. They paid me to tell them. This turned out to be a sufficient business model. By month 8, I had added 2 more clients and hired my first employee, a woman named Jessie who had been an analyst at a different consulting firm and who had the specific quality I valued most in people I worked with closely. She said what she saw, she asked the questions that needed asking, and she never performed more certainty than she actually had. I paid her more than she had been making at the firm because the margin supported it and because I had spent enough years watching organizations lose good people by assuming loyalty was cheaper than compensation. By month 12 I had 4 clients for employees, and a monthly revenue that had surpassed what I had been earning at my previous firm in the 3rd month after founding and had not dropped below it since. I moved the operation from my spare bedroom to the 4th floor office suite in November, which cost more per month than I had been paying in rent for my entire apartment, and which I justified on the grounds that clients who came to see you in an actual office were clients who took you seriously, and clients who took you seriously paid their invoices on time. The healthcare contract came in December. Meridian Health Systems was a regional network operating 12 facilities across Ohio and Indiana, and they had a specific problem. Their operational costs had been increasing faster than their patient volume for 3 consecutive years, and their internal teams had not been able to identify the source with enough precision to address it. I was introduced to their COO, David Hartwell, through a contact at a previous client, and I spent 2 weeks in November developing a proposal that was specific enough to demonstrate that I understood their situation and ambitious enough to demonstrate that I believed the problem was solvable. The contract was worth $480,000 over 18 months. It was the largest engagement Callaway Strategic Partners had taken on. It was also, though I did not know this when I signed it, an engagement with an organization that had a long-standing facilities contracting relationship with my father's engineering firm. I found this out in the third week of the engagement when I was reviewing Meridian's vendor list as part of the operational assessment and saw Callaway Engineering Consultants on the quarterly payment schedule. I looked at it for a moment. Then I kept working. I did not call my father. I did not mention it at Sunday dinner, which happened 2 weeks later, and at which I told my father that things were going well and that we had signed a significant new client, and at which he laughed. I went home that evening and I made a decision that was less a decision than a recognition of something I already understood. The work would speak. It always spoke. I just needed to get out of the way and let it. Sunday dinner in my family happened every 2 weeks at my parents' house in Dayton, a tradition my mother maintained with the specific energy of a woman who understood that traditions were the scaffolding that held families together between the moments when families actually needed each other. She cooked. My father sat at the head of the table. Kevin and his wife Sarah drove in from Cincinnati. I drove in from Columbus. We ate and we talked and we performed the version of our family that was comfortable enough to sustain a biweekly commitment and honest enough, in its better moments, to occasionally say something real. The dinner where I told my father about Meridian was a better moment in most respects. Kevin was in a good mood. My mother had made the roast that she made when she wanted the evening to go well. The conversation had moved through the usual subjects. Kevin's work, Sarah's sister's upcoming wedding, my mother's hospital politics, and arrived, as it sometimes did when things were going well enough that I felt like trying at my work. I said we had signed a significant new client. A regional healthcare network. Things were going well. My father looked up from his plate and said, with the specific tone of a man who has been waiting patiently for reality to arrive, whether I had thought about getting a real job yet. I said this was a real job. He laughed. He picked up his beer. He asked Kevin about the Cincinnati Bengals. I looked at my mother. She looked at her roast. She said the roast had turned out well, hadn't it? I agreed that it had. I ate my dinner. I drove back to Columbus. I went to bed and I slept well because I had learned by 31 that other people's inability to see what you were building was not information about what you were building. It was information about them. 3 weeks later, David Hartwell called my father. David Hartwell was the kind of COO who had built his career on the specific skill of understanding how organizations actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work, which meant he was very good at tracing effects back to causes and very direct about what he found. He had commissioned the Callaway Strategic Partners engagement because an internal operational review had been completed the previous year and had produced recommendations that nobody had been able to implement because the recommendations were too general to act on. He wanted specific findings and specific action items, and he had said so in our first meeting with a directness I found genuinely refreshing. By week 3 of the engagement, I had identified 2 significant cost drivers that the internal review had missed. A staffing allocation pattern in the nursing supervision structure that was generating overtime costs at 3 facilities that could be restructured without reducing coverage, and a procurement consolidation opportunity in their supply chain that had been obscured by the way their vendor management system categorized spending. I had put both findings in a preliminary memo that I sent to David on a Thursday morning. David called me Friday afternoon to say the nursing supervision finding alone, if implemented, would reduce overtime costs by approximately $2.3 million annually. He said it was the clearest operational diagnosis his organization had received in 7 years. He asked if I had additional capacity to expand the scope of the engagement. I said I did. He said he also wanted to ask me something that was slightly outside the scope of the current work. He said his facilities team had flagged a contracting relationship they wanted to review. An engineering consulting firm called Callaway Engineering that had been doing facilities work for Meridian for 11 years. He said the relationship had been good historically, but the team felt the current contract terms might not reflect current market rates and they wanted a fresh perspective. I said I was familiar with the firm. He asked how I was familiar with it. I said, "It's my father's company." There was a pause. Then David said, "That is either a conflict of interest or a very useful coincidence." I said, "It depends on what you need from me." He said he needed an honest assessment of whether the current contract terms were competitive. He said if I could not provide that objectively, he understood completely and would find another resource. I said I could provide it objectively. I said the findings would be what they were regardless of who owned the firm. He said that was what he had expected me to say. He said he would send me the current contract terms. Then he said, "I should mention, I realized this morning that I know a Robert Callaway at the firm. I called him this morning to let him know we were doing the review. I wanted to make sure there were no surprises." I said, "What did he say?" David said, "He asked me how I knew about Callaway Strategic Partners." Pause. I told him his daughter ran it. He went very quiet for a moment. Then he asked me to repeat the name. I said, "What did you tell him?" David said, "I told him it was the best operational diagnosis my organization had received in 7 years." Another pause. He said he didn't know. I looked out my office window at the Columbus skyline for a moment. Then I said, "No, he didn't." David said, "He seemed to feel that quite strongly." I said, "I imagine he did." My father called that Sunday morning before I had left for Dayton. His voice when I answered had lost something I recognized from the call I had described to you earlier. Not the confidence exactly, but the specific certainty underneath the confidence. The bedrock assumption that he understood the dimensions of what his children were doing and could assess them accurately. He said, "David Hartwell called me this week." I said, "I know." He said, "He told me about the contract." I said, "Yes." He said, "Megan, $480,000. Not a question. Something between a reckoning and an inventory." I said, "That's the current engagement. We have 3 others running concurrently." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long has this been going on?" I said, 14 months since I founded. 3 years before that at the firm building the client base." He said, "The spare bedroom." I said, "And then the 4th floor office suite." "Since November." He said, "I didn't know about the office." I said, "You laughed at Sunday dinner and asked Kevin about the Bengals." The silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds. "I know because I counted." He said, "That was wrong of me." I said, "Yes." He said, "I thought." He stopped. Started again. "I thought it was like the thing in college. When you said you were going to run the student government budget and I said that wasn't a real responsibility. I said, and I cut $60,000 in redundant programming and you called it a lucky guess. He said, I remember that. I said, I know. Another silence. Then, the Meridian contract review. David sending you our terms. I said, he already sent them. He said, and? I said, the base rate is competitive. The escalation clause hasn't been renegotiated in 4 years and the current market rate is about 12% higher. If Meridian pushes on that number, you should be prepared to meet them somewhere in the middle. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the call might simply end in the specific silence of a man recalibrating a significant number of things at once. Then he said, You're telling me this. I said, You're my father. The assessment is what it is. What you do with it is your business. He said, Most people in your position would have just let it play out. I said, I'm not most people in my position. He said, No, boss. I'm beginning to understand that. The consequences of David Hartwell's phone call moved through my family in the specific way that sudden clarity moves through a system that has been operating on incomplete information. Quickly, thoroughly, and with a kind of irreversibility that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with the simple fact that once you know a thing you cannot unknow it. My father renegotiated the Meridian contract within 3 weeks, accepting a rate adjustment that David's team had proposed and which my assessment had told him was fair. The renegotiation went smoothly because my father was, when stripped of the certainty that everything was already as it should be, a genuinely competent professional who understood the work and the relationship and how to navigate both. David told me afterward that Robert Calloway had been straightforward and professional throughout the process. I told David that my father was straightforward and professional when he was operating with accurate information. David said that was true of most people. I agreed that it was. My father expanded the Meridian relationship in the quarter that followed, taking on 2 additional facilities projects that had been in discussion but unresolved. He called me after the second one closed and told me without preamble that the expansion had happened partly because David Hartwell's team had developed a favorable impression of the Calloway name through our operational work, and that he was aware of this and wanted me to know he was aware of it. I said, The work speaks for itself. He said, Both works apparently. I said, Yes. Kevin called the week after the Sunday when my father had come to dinner with the specific energy of a man who has recently revised something important and wants to discuss it in the way that men often discuss things they have revised, indirectly through adjacent subjects, with the revision present in the conversation without being its explicit topic. Kevin was not like my father in most ways, but he had inherited this particular quality and I had learned to read it. He said he had heard about the Meridian thing from Dad. I said yes. He said Dad had seemed different at Sunday dinner. I said how so? He said quieter. He said he had asked me more questions than usual. He said he had asked Kevin whether he had known about the business, and Kevin had said he had known in the general sense that I was doing consulting work, and Kevin had not known the specifics, and Dad had said he should have known the specifics, and Kevin had said probably yes. I said that was accurate. Kevin said, He's proud of you. He just doesn't have the vocabulary for it yet because he spent a long time being certain he already knew what there was to know about what you were doing. I said, I know. Kevin said, he'll get there. I said, he's already started. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She was a Sunday phone caller, structured and deliberate in her communication the way she was structured and deliberate in most things. She said she had been thinking about the Sunday dinner 3 weeks ago. She said she had watched me tell my father about the contract and she had watched him laugh and she had not said anything because she had not known what to say and she had been thinking about that silence since. I said, "It's okay, Mom." She said, "It's not actually. I've been routing around things in this family for a long time. Sometimes routing around something is the right call. Sometimes it just means the thing keeps happening." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry I didn't say something." I said, "I know you are." She said, "Tell me about the business. Actually tell me. I want to know." I told her. All of it. The 14 months, the clients, the employees, the office suite, the Meridian contract, the preliminary findings, the $2.3 million in projected overtime savings. She listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of gift. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You built all of that?" I said, "Yes." She said, "While we were having Sunday dinners and not asking." I said, "While we were having Sunday dinners and not asking." She made a sound that I recognized as grief wearing the clothes of ordinary emotion. Then she said, "Oi, next Sunday you're going to tell your father everything you just told me. And he is going to listen." I said, "Is he?" She said, "He is. I'll make sure of it." She did. It was the most direct thing I had ever heard her do. I did not move cities. I did not need to. Columbus was where I had built the thing and Columbus was where I intended to keep building it, and the work of building it was more interesting to me than the symbolic gesture of starting over somewhere else, which was a gesture for people who were leaving something rather than growing something. What I did do in the months after the Meridian contract was expand deliberately and without haste. We took on 2 new clients in January, both referrals from existing clients, which was the cleanest form of growth because it meant the work was generating its own momentum. I promoted Jesse to senior associate and hired 2 more people, bringing the team to 7, and moved into a larger office suite on the 6th floor of the same building because the 4th floor had become genuinely insufficient and I had learned not to let operational constraints become identity constraints. By the end of the following year, Callaway Strategic Partners had generated $2.1 million in annual revenue. I held 100% of the equity. I had 9 employees and a client roster that spanned healthcare, logistics, financial services, and regional manufacturing. I had been asked twice to speak at industry events and had done so once, because once was enough to establish that I was available, and twice in the same year felt like performing rather than working. My father and I developed, in the 18 months after the Hartwell call, something I had not expected and had not planned for, but which turned out to be the most valuable thing to emerge from the entire sequence of events. We developed a working relationship, not just a familial one. He began calling me occasionally with questions about contracts and client management and the specific challenges of running an independent consulting practice with a small team, and I answered them in the same way I answered any professional question. directly with the information I actually had without softening. He received the answers the same way. The conversations were short and specific and contained more honesty than any conversation we had had at a Sunday dinner. At one of those Sunday dinners, 6 months after the Hartwell call, he said something I had not heard him say in 31 years in that precise form. He said he had been thinking about the student government budget. He said he had called it a lucky guess. He said he had been wrong about that and he wanted to say so directly. I said, "That was a long time ago." He said, "It was. But it was wrong and I've been wrong about several things in the same direction since and I wanted you to know I understand that now." I said, "I know you do." He said, "I'm proud of what you've built." I said, "Thank you, Dad." He said, "I should have said that a long time ago too." I said, "Yes." Then my mother called us both to the table and we had dinner and Kevin talked about the Bengals and my mother's roast was excellent and the evening was not cinematic and not healed and not the family I would have designed if I had been designing families. It was the family I had, operating with better information than it had had before, making the adjustments that better information allows. That was enough. For now it was exactly enough. I think about the laugh sometimes. The specific sound of it, the way it lasted about 2 seconds and then became a question about football, the complete and unexamined certainty it contained about the distance between what I was building and what counted as worth taking seriously. I do not think about it with anger. I have not thought about it with anger for a long time. I think about it with something more like curiosity, about what it takes to see something that does not fit the map you have been using, about what makes people update their maps and what makes them defend them, about the gap between the person your family sees and the person you are actually becoming in the spaces they do not know to look. What I know now that I did not know at 27, standing at my father's dinner table with a $480,000 contract in my recent past and a laugh in my immediate present, is this: the work does not require witnesses to be real. The contract was real before David Hartwell called. The office was real before my father knew it existed. The employees and the clients and the revenue and the results were real the entire time, independent of anyone's awareness of them, building and compounding in the background of a family dinner conversation that moved on to other subjects. The witnesses arrive eventually. They always do. You do not need to manufacture the moment. You need to build the thing and let the thing speak and trust that what is real will eventually become visible to the people who matter, whether they are looking for it or not. My father was not looking. David Hartwell called him anyway. That is how real things work. They do not wait to be acknowledged. They simply continue existing until the world has no choice but to notice them. If you have ever built something significant in a room where no one thought to look, if you have ever had the experience of being laughed at and being right, of being dismissed and being correct, of carrying something real into a conversation where no one asked the right questions, I want you to tell me in the comments. Tell me what the laugh sounded like. Tell me what you were actually building when it happened. Tell me how long it took for the room to catch up. Because I believe the distance between the laugh and the phone call is where everything important happens. And I believe the people who keep building in that distance are the ones who ultimately determine what the story is about. Keep building. Document everything. The calls come. Thank you for watching this story to its end. Everything depicted here is entirely fictional and created solely for entertainment, emotional reflection and storytelling purposes. The characters, events, and situations do not represent real people or actual occurrences. We hope this story reminds you that being laughed at is not a verdict on what you are building. It is simply evidence of what the person laughing cannot yet see. Keep building until they can. Asterisk.